All right, the slow, steady overhaul of the criminal justice system is continuing as states revisit nonviolent drug convictions. The federal government revises mandatory sentences, and Florida restores ex-felon voting rights. California is joining that conversation as Governor Gavin Newsom is set to sign an executive order this hour placing a moratorium on the death penalty in California. And this is a larger trend of giving capital punishment another look. Let me tell you a little bit about capital punishment right now. Currently, there are more than 2,700 death row inmates. Let me go back one slide to this. Well, okay, that's not really working, so maybe I'll ask. There we go. 2,732 death row inmates nationwide. Of that, 737 are in California. Now, nearly 1,500, let's swipe that if we can, nearly 1,500 previous inmates have been executed since the death penalty was reinstated in 1976. Of those, 13 were put to death in California. The last execution in California taking place in 2006. However, there's concern about inmates being executed for crimes they didn't commit. According to the nonprofit Death Penalty Information Center, 164 death row inmates have been exonerated since 1973. 164 since 1973. Of those, 5 were in California. Now, the number may seem small compared to the number of people who are in death row, but I guess when you're talking about taking a life, both of these numbers should be absolutely zero. Now, let's just talk about how this breaks down in the country. The South, by far, executes the largest number of people, putting more than 1,200 to death between 1976 and 2017. However, if you think of the death penalty as a deterrent, it apparently is relatively ineffective because FBI statistics show that the murder rate in the South is just over twice the murder rate in the Northeast, despite the South making up about 80% of all executions. And you can parse these numbers lots of different ways. So before somebody tweets me and tells me, well, you're looking at it differently, there's no other way to look at this. There are lots of different ways in which places that execute lots of people don't actually have a lower violent crime or murder rate. So it's causing people to take a look at death penalty cases. Since 1998, death sentences handed down have actually dropped dramatically from nearly 320 years ago to just 42 in 2018. Steph?
Joining us now, Lauren-Brooke Eisen, Senior Counsel at the Brennan Center for Justice and author of Inside Private Prisons, An American Dilemma in the Age of Mass Incarceration. Let's start with what's happening in California. Why would the governor do this now?
So the governor is, he is issuing this executive order today, and this is part of a wider trend in the nation right now towards more progressive, more humane, more fair criminal justice policies. We recently just saw a bill on Capitol Hill pass called the First Step Act, and that represented bipartisan criminal justice reform. The President of the United States signed that bill.
It was a real standout because at the moment that passed, there was nothing bipartisan of meaning getting done.
Exactly, and this is criminal justice reform. Additionally, the last election of last November illustrates nothing other than criminal justice reform is certainly, a big important area right now. And what we saw in Florida with voters passing a ballot initiative to eliminate felon disenfranchisement in the state of Florida is transformational change in this country. We've seen Latinos, blacks, and women elected into the office of prosecutor across the country. So this is part of that wider trend. And the statistic that you mentioned is really important. So you mentioned that over 164 people on death row across the country have been set free from death row because they were wrongfully convicted.
Right, so this is not changing of the sentence or thinking the sentence was too high. It's you got the wrong person or you got the person for the wrong crime.
There's a lot of doubt about a lot of the convictions in our country that have resulted in the death penalty. And you just spoke about how California has more people on death row than any other state in this country. Florida, a southern state, happens to have the second largest death row in this country. And, Governor Newsom is taking a stand here, and he is saying, and he said it in his executive order, the death penalty, the way it is applied in this country, is discriminatory against black people, against people of color, and against a lot of people who suffer from mental illness. And there are a lot of
Highly
statistics behind this executive order.
But is this the way to do it? One of the things we're often critical of with President Trump, and by the way, there was a criticism of President Obama and President Clinton, President Bush, for using executive orders to do things that need to be done legislatively. Is there a legislative fix to this that is meant to follow what Gavin Newsom is doing?
So what Gavin Newsom did is well within his authority and discretion as governor of the state of California. And in fact, he is following the lead of 3 other governors. Colorado, Washington State, and Oregon all have governors who have done the same exact thing. And through executive order, they have issued this moratorium on death penalties. You're right, there are 18 states that have eliminated the death penalty through legislation. And what California has wrestled with is, they have had ballot initiatives in 2012 and 2016 that have asked voters to vote on eliminating the death penalty in the state of California. Now, both of those ballot initiatives have actually failed. Interestingly enough, the one in 2016 happened right after some pretty high-profile shootings in the state of California in San Bernardino County. And additionally, what's very interesting about the ballot initiatives in California of 2016 is that voters, in fact, not only declined to eliminate the death penalty in California, but they voted to speed up the process. And part of that reasoning is because the death penalty process is very lengthy, very costly. In fact, California alone has spent more than $5 billion since the mid-1970s just on death row.
It's inefficient and expensive. All right, Lauren-Brooke Eisen, thank you so much for sharing that with us. Lauren-Brooke Eisen is an author of a great book called Inside Private Prisons, An American Dilemma in the Age of Mass Incarceration, which we've talked about in the past. So thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Hey, MSNBC fans, thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on that button down there and click on any of the videos here to watch the latest interviews and highlights. You can get more MSNBC for free every day with our newsletters. Just visit msnbc.com/newsletters to sign up now.